Hello, welcome to Citizens for Global Solutions Minnesota. I'm Katya. Citizens for Global Solutions Minnesota is a nonprofit organization based in the state of Minnesota in the United States. Every month, we host one of our online projects. Today, it's time for our Human Rights Forum, and our guest speaker will discuss the global challenges in a year of elections. This event is free and open to anyone. If you want to learn more about CGS Minnesota work, please visit our website at www.globalsolutionsmn.org and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn. And today, our guest speaker is Thomas Hanson, who is a former U.S. Foreign Service officer with the Department of State, whose diplomatic postings included East Germany, France, Norway, the Soviet Union, Sweden, and the former Soviet Republic of Georgia. He also participated in the opening of the U.S. embassies in Mongolia and Estonia, worked on the foreign relations committees of the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives, and served as director for NATO and European Affairs at the Atlantic Council of the United States in Washington, D.C. Mr. Hanson holds a BA degree from the University of Minnesota and graduate degrees from Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, the Institute of Advanced International Studies in Geneva, Switzerland, and the National School of Administration in Paris, France. Thomas Hanson, you're very welcome among us. The floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Katya, for that nice introduction. And thank you to Citizens for Global Solutions for inviting me tonight. I understand we have about an hour total, and I want to be sure to leave some time for your questions toward the end. Our topic, as advertised, is global challenges in a year of elections. And of course, yes, it's exactly 2 weeks until our election takes place. And this comes amid a year of an unusual number of elections around the world. It's estimated that up to 3 billion people will have gone to the polls this year, which is, I believe, a record. So already, looking at what's transpired, you can see some important results. In Mexico, for example, for the first time, a female president has been elected, Claudia Sheinbaum. Mexico beat us to it. By how long, we'll see. But this is a very important result. In Taiwan, there was a mixed result in their election where a pro, sort of not independence, but sort of a skeptical candidate toward China won the presidency, Lai Ching-te, but a more friendly party to China, the Kuomintang, did well in the parliament. So a mixed result there. In India, Narendra Modi lost his majority in parliament, which will make for a slightly more difficult situation going forward for him. In Iran, a moderate was elected, Mr. Pezeshkian, who, of course, now with the turmoil in the Middle East, is being caught up in all of the events there. One trend, before we turn to our election and the challenges, has been toward a number of managed democracies, I guess you could call them, where the result is sort of affected ahead of time by who's allowed to run. This happened, of course, in Russia, when a pro-peace candidate was disqualified by the Electoral Commission for not having enough signatures. Same thing happened in Pakistan. I think that the trend toward democracy, which we saw starting in 1989, has slowed down and maybe in the last few years has gone slightly into reverse. And so this trend toward managed democracies, or democracies that on the basis of a free election become less democratic, is something worth understanding and studying. One final trend, and this we see across the Atlantic in the West, populist parties are rising of the left and the right. This is true in France, which we saw just this summer, in Germany, in local elections, in the European Parliament elections, also in the Austrian elections, the Dutch elections. And so what you have in many of these European countries is strong parties of the left and the right, very populist, and then weak centrist coalitions trying to keep them at bay. And so the governance is an issue over there right now among our European allies. The same themes that we see here at home in the populist movements here are found in Europe. The three main topics that they harp upon, and that is immigration, of course, inflation, and war. The idea that the world is in a chaotic state, and these populist candidates promise to end these wars, but without really saying how they would do that. So among all these elections that have taken place, ours is next up, and it's the one that's getting obviously the most attention. United States right now is a factor for uncertainty in much of the world. A lot of people, a lot of issues are on hold as they wait to see how our election turns out in the coming 2 weeks. So once again, a year of elections, and the challenges that will face whoever wins our election are severe. Obviously, we have two conflicts right now in Ukraine and in Gaza, which are in a crisis, each of them, with very little sense of how to move forward. Really, nobody has concrete proposals on how to get these crises resolved. And our allies in each case would like us to become more involved, maybe even risk a larger war with countries like Russia in the one case or Iran in the other. So the next president in the US will face some really stark challenges on how to move forward. And this is not even to mention the underlying situation with China. So I'll talk about all those issues in the course of my remarks today. I was struck by a speech given by Antonio Guterres, the UN General Secretary, at the UNGA just a month or so ago. Guterres described a world in which he said global order had broken down. And rather than trends, he said we could only speak of a whirlwind at this point. It is a very disrupted situation. And he cited three basic issues that he considers to be driving this state of affairs. Number one, impunity. That around the world now, perhaps more than ever, countries and actors are acting with total impunity. And whether it's the Russians invading Ukraine or things that are happening in the Middle East. And Guterres lamented this fact and that there really are no brakes, it seems right now, on a lot of what's going on. Second of the 3 points he underscored inequality. In his view, the growing inequality in the world today, and some of it caused by the new technologies that are emerging and have a centralizing effect, if anything, on income, that inequality is causing instability, political instability in many, many, many countries around the world. And he cited this as something that eventually has to be addressed globally. And then third, after impunity and inequality, uncertainty that all of us feel right now. And he put his finger on something when he said that the uncertainty is because people feel that the real threats, the crises in the world today, are not being addressed. And these are the larger threats of climate, pandemics, the threats that are at a species level, if you will. And in his view, the reason this was happening is because geopolitics today, the old-fashioned territorialism and geopolitics, are overwhelming cooperation on these larger issues. Ironically, the same conclusion was reached at last year's World Economic Forum in Davos by the global elite that meets every year there in January. Same conclusion about the geopolitics taking precedence over these larger threats. So, And the result of this is a lack of trust globally. And in my view, that worsens what always is the basic dilemma of international politics and diplomacy. And that is what they call the security dilemma, in which actions by one country, which that country perceives as defensive, are seen by other countries or another country as offensive. And the cycle just goes back and forth and escalates. And when there's no trust in the system, this can lead to real problems. Obviously, the key relationship in that regard now is the US and China. I think we can sum up the tensions by noting that the United States became the largest economy in the world way back in 1889. That was the turning point when the American century really began. And today we see China coming up, and by some estimates, purchasing power parity, already having surpassed us in GDP. Now they're having a lot of problems, and so this is not a certain situation, but this change is causing tensions in the system. And China is interwoven into many of the crises today in very indirect ways, as I'll describe in the course of my remarks. So having outlined some of those issues, I want to turn now to the crises that I mentioned earlier, and starting with Ukraine, which is an absolute tragedy. This is not a country that should have been asked to choose. In the early 2000s, if you looked at Russian speakers within Ukraine, over in eastern Ukraine, it was about 92%, far over in western Ukraine, about 5%. These are two very different cultural realms. Western Ukraine, around Lviv, historically has been part of Poland and part of the Habsburg Empire for long periods of time. The religion there, the Uniate faith, is different from the Orthodox faith in that it recognizes the Pope. So this is a country that had internal tensions built into it, which exploded, as we all know, in early 2022. The Russians are engaged in, I guess, what you might call aggressive attrition. They are attacking the infrastructure, energy grids all across Ukraine, trying to basically weaken and wear down the Ukrainians. And Ukraine is tragically being worn down. They suffer from a severe lack of manpower at this point. Many Ukrainians have left. Many have been killed. The numbers are quite high. And there's a lack of ammunition and weaponry. The West has not been able to supply enough ordnance and weaponry to Ukraine, clearly. So it's gotten to the point where the foreign minister of Poland, Radek Sikorski, visited his counterpart in Kiev recently, and the two foreign ministers declared that the European Union must cut off all draft-age Ukrainian males who are in the EU, and it's estimated over 1 million of them. The idea would be that all European Union countries would cut off the financial benefits, economic benefits to these young men. And of course, that's not going to happen, but it shows the degree of strain right now that is underway. Now, there's an irony here in that early in the war, within the first weeks, negotiations began, and between Russia and Ukraine, brokered by the Israelis, Naftali Bennett, the foreign minister, and also Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey, trying to find some kind of a solution. And a draft agreement was in fact reached. Now, whether this could have been a basis is hard to say, because it included neutrality for Ukraine, and it included Russia pulling back to the pre-invasion boundaries. Now, the United States and the United Kingdom, seeing this draft, contacted the Ukrainians and said, look, do not compromise here, because we are going to give you all the weapons you need. Our sanctions will bring Russia to its knees, and no need to compromise. I find it very tragic and unfortunate that we really have not followed through fully with the Ukrainians on this, and the situation right now is really quite dire. The North Koreans are working with the Russians here, providing various kinds of assistance, as is Iran. And so Russia's getting outside help on things like drones and other weaponry. So in this situation, Volodymyr Zelensky has come up with a victory plan. And this is where we are now. And these are the decisions the next president will have to make. Zelensky says that the only way forward now is for the West to fully engage in support of Ukraine to prevent the disaster of a Russian victory. So he calls for a system of interconnected solutions to make Russia seek peace. As he says, to reach Putin's bubble, whatever that means. He's asking for security guarantees from the West, ideally NATO membership, and especially long-range weapons that would allow Ukraine to strike far, far into Russia. Now, this is controversial because the weapons that he would like to have, on the one hand, the Storm Shadow missile, which is British, and ATACMS missiles, which are American, can only be operated by British and American forces. They cannot be operated by the Ukrainians. It's too complex. So that if we were to use these weapons, it would be pretty much manned, targeted, everything else by NATO, by the US. And Vladimir Putin has said that if these long-range weapons are operated by NATO, then NATO will be at war with Russia, whatever that means. Now, this is another red line, and people are divided as to whether we should recognize this red line. Europe is divided on what to do. The British, Poles, Balts, Canada, others think we should take the risk and use these weapons to strike deep into Russia to put more pressure on Putin. The Germans, French, Italians to some extent are skeptical and are worried about this. Olaf Scholz has refused to allow a similar German missile to be used in Ukraine because he thought it may start a major war. In Washington, too, there are divisions. Rumor has it, I don't know if this is true, that Tony Blinken might be in favor of doing this, but Bill Burns, Jake Sullivan, and I think the Pentagon are skeptical, thinking that it would be too provocative. And so when Biden met with Zelensky recently, he basically demurred on Zelensky's request and promised aid, but not the thing that he was looking for. So this is being kicked down the road to the new administration, who will have to make these very, very fateful decisions. Now, if we look briefly at what sort of straws in the wind, J.D. Vance gave a speech recently presenting what he said was the plan that was being envisaged. Whether this is clear with Trump, I don't know. But J.D. Vance said that there should be a negotiated settlement immediately. There should be the current line of demarcation in the conflict should become the border, reinforced by peacekeeping forces, and that the rest of Ukraine should become independent but neutral. Now, this is a very controversial proposal. I mean, it would give Russia a lot of what it wanted. Putin has said he's willing to negotiate on the basis of that early 2022 agreement that I mentioned before that didn't go anywhere. So we'll see. Now, another suggestion that's in the wind is called NATO for land, that the conflict should be frozen, just like J.D. Vance says, but then the rest of Ukraine should join NATO immediately. And Russia should be presented with an ultimatum. If they move 1 foot further into what is now NATO territory, they'll be at war. And then it'll be like a divided Germany, where no one ever, I mean, the West did not accept East Germany, and eventually the two sides of Germany were united. So this is called NATO for land. So we'll see very difficult decisions are waiting on Ukraine for the next president. Now, Middle East. Why did October 7th happen? And I'll just describe briefly how this came about. For most of the post-war era, the U.S. has supported a two-state solution in the Middle East for the Palestinians. President Trump, when he came in, didn't disavow that necessarily, but he put it way on the back burner and pursued what he called the Abraham Accords to get Middle Eastern countries to recognize Israel while really not addressing the Palestinian issue. Now, the Democrats severely criticized that, saying you're abandoning the Palestinians. And when Biden came in, he was very, very negative toward Mohammed bin Salman and the Saudis for the Khashoggi murder, and relations were terrible. We launched investigations of MBS, and there was really no dialogue until the Biden administration saw that China was establishing much closer relations with Saudi Arabia. This is when I say China's woven in. This is an example. China and Saudi Arabia are talking about a petro-yuan. Saudi Arabia has joined the BRICS, which is a new organization I'll talk about later, a big indication of their drawing closer. So the Biden team, seeing this, made a 180-degree shift and fully embraced the Abraham Accords in late 2021, or 2022 rather, and began to press hard for a Saudi reconciliation with Israel without addressing the Palestinian issue. Both Joe Biden and the Hamas leadership have said that October 7th happened in order to disrupt this reconciliation between the Saudis and Israel, which the Palestinians saw as their last support. And as it's turning out, everyone now is embracing again the two-state solution, from Joe Biden to the Saudis, who say no agreement until there's a two-state solution, to Kamala Harris, who puts the two-state solution up front. So we'll see how this develops. Now, it's a tragedy what's going on right now. I won't go into details, but there's way too much suffering. October 7th was a human rights violation of enormous proportions. What's happening there right now is tragic. The Israelis now have moved into Lebanon. About 60,000 Israelis have had to flee from northern Israel to the south because of Hezbollah targeting of that area. So Israel is trying to drive Hezbollah north of the Litani River, well into Lebanon. They are bombing Beirut. They killed Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, among other leaders. I think it's very significant that in order to kill Nasrallah, in one attack, Israel dropped 2,000-pound bombs on the site where Nasrallah was. 86 of them. They dropped 86 2,000-pound bombs to try to get Nasrallah. So we'll see how this goes forward. At the present time, 146 countries in the UN recognize a Palestinian state, most recently Norway, Ireland, and Spain. A two-state solution is out there, but it's very hard to see how this can go forward right now. And of course, the tragedy in the Middle East is taking up much of the attention now that was going before to Ukraine. So I think one result from what's happening both in Gaza and in Ukraine is that the United States is realizing that we have lost the global South, what people call now the global majority, which will be about 85% of the global population by the end of this century, with Africa, according to the UN, accounting for nearly 40%. Most of these countries have demurred on Ukraine. They have not gotten involved in sanctions at all. They've been dealing with Russia, and they are, in a sense, sort of spurning US policy and US demands to become more involved. So this is a new equation for Washington. Now, in this situation where we have the US-China tension, all these crises breaking out, the Biden administration clearly wants to work with allies, to use allies to strengthen the US, both in Europe and in Asia. So obviously NATO has expanded, with Finland and Sweden now joining a huge new border with Russia, which they cannot have intended as a result of this. But we're also trying to engage several of our Asian allies, what we call the IP4, Indo-Pacific 4, which Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, and Australia, and link them up with NATO. So in other words, a kind of a semi-alliance taking form on both sides of Eurasia. Now, in the Eurasian heartland, a country like China now is pursuing what I would call a geoeconomic strategy, not military or geopolitical so much. Several organizations, the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, are expanding, as I'll describe, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Belt and Road Initiative, which the Chinese have undertaken. I think the feeling in China and Russia, at least this is what they say, is that Eurasia is returning to the center of the global economy and global politics, that the transatlantic era, 500 years arguably of the transatlantic era, is coming to an end. And that therefore they are now engaged with countries far away like Brazil, South Africa. Turkey is joining now. Several NATO countries are looking to join this new arrangement, which they believe will be the future of a world that is multipolar. The IMF, International Monetary Fund, estimates now that the BRICS will account for 37% of global GDP by the end of this decade, compared to 28% for the G7. That it has 41% of the world population. Now, this arrangement, the BRICS, is not an alliance. I have to underscore that. There are many different views there. A country like India is close to us, but also close to this organization. Modi calls India multi-aligned today. In other words, it's trying to have good relations in a lot of directions. So the BRICS are meeting as we speak in Russia, in Kazan. They're having a major summit. They now have brought on 9 countries, including Saudi Arabia, Iran, and others. 34 more want to join, including Turkey, Thailand, and a number of other semi-Western countries. They will probably be brought on as sort of de facto but not full members, because the BRICS don't want to expand so fast that it becomes chaos. But there are many, many more countries wanting to join what is basically an economic arrangement, but is one that's doing a couple of important things. They are in the process of developing a digital currency outside the dollar, which will be used for transactions, global transactions among countries. They may announce something major about this week. Once again, this is a potential threat, long-term threat to the dollar, which Washington is watching very closely. So just to conclude now, a little bit on China. China is not 10 feet tall. It has about 1.4 billion citizens today, but according to the UN, by the end of this century, it will have more like 770,000, which means a reduction of about 50% of their overall population. So these are major changes. Many countries are declining right now in population, but it's fairly dramatic in China. Now, Yuan Shuitong, who is one of their main analysts, said recently, Chinese, that in his view, this is not a new Cold War that we're in right now, but the world is in a new era where power is based on something new. It's not based on the traditional measurements of power. It's based now on technologies. And whoever wins the race to technologies will be the most powerful country. And of course, we're talking about quantum, hypersonics, 6G, artificial intelligence. And the US government has concluded that China is actually ahead in a number of these key areas. So the Biden administration's policy has been to try to slow China down in its technological development through something called the CHIPS Act, which would restrict Chinese access to certain technologies, while using subsidies to draw supply chains and tech supply chains to the US. We're spending a lot of money on these subsidies to try to catch up quickly. The problem is, and this is a larger problem for us right now, is that none of this is funded. We haven't had tax increases for a long time. So our deficit is going up very fast to about 36 trillion right now. So that's going to be a big issue for the next president, how to keep our ends and our means in harmony while still doing the necessary for security and for our economy. It's not clear how we're going to do this without some domestic adjustments. Now, my very last point here is, in the midst of this rather chaotic global situation with a lot of geopolitical tensions, the nuclear issue is unaddressed. A lot of the nuclear agreements from the Cold War have fallen by the wayside. They're no longer in effect. And the last one, the last major one, which is the New START Treaty, is up to expire in early 2026, and it doesn't look like it'll be renewed. Meanwhile, China is increasing its nuclear defense, and we are embarked on a major nuclear arms buildup and modernization. The New York Times had a 3 full-page article about this a week or so ago in its weekend edition. Now, this buildup was actually started by the Obama administration way back in order to get support in Congress for the Iran nuclear deal. The Obama team agreed to this major modernization, which now is really starting to take effect and is going to cost a lot of money. So I think that the nuclear issue, especially with Putin rattling the nuclear saber, and obviously the Middle East very explosive, at some point we're going to have to address this issue more directly. And I'll conclude with something that's on the horizon that may impact our consciousness in the next year or two. I recall during the Cold War, there were films in the popular culture, things like The Day After, for example, about a nuclear war affecting a town in Ohio, or Testament, which kind of got people's consciousness raised. And actually during the Cold War, people were very aware of the nuclear threat, unlike today. So there's a new book that's just come out by Annie Jacobson called Nuclear War: A Scenario. It goes step by step how a nuclear war might break out. And it's a lot of research. Apparently the science is good. And it's a kind of harrowing view of how easily this could happen. So this is having an impact, but an even greater impact will come in a year or so. Denis de Villeneuve, one of the top directors in Washington, in Hollywood rather, who's done films like Arrival, Blade Runner 2049, the Dune trilogy, plans to make a movie out of nuclear war scenario, in which there will be graphic depiction of how a nuclear war could break out. Now, there was some of this in the Oppenheimer film showing how this all started, but this will be a bookend and could actually have a major effect. So, because nuclear war is something that just cannot be ignored. As JFK, John F. Kennedy, said once in one of his major speeches, I speak of peace due to the new face of war. And that's the situation we're in. So I'm basically optimistic. I'm looking forward to the results of our election. And I look forward to your question.
Thank you, Tom. It's always wonderful to hear you speaking. I have a question for you. What do you think were Putin's real intentions when he first invaded Ukraine? And do these intentions remain the same, or did they shift?
Good question. That's a really good question. So, I was active on these issues in the 90s, early 2000s, when the Cold War ended, the Berlin Wall collapsed, Russia went through the 90s, and NATO began gradually to expand. The decision was made in 1994 by Bill Clinton, and by the late 90s and in 2004, there were several rounds of expansion, including to the Baltic states. So all Russian leaders, starting with Yeltsin, Gorbachev, although he was no longer in power, was very verbal about this, were warning the West that this NATO expansion was beginning to encroach into what they considered to be a sensitive area of their periphery. I mean, we reacted strongly on the Cuban Missile Crisis. Large powers tend to do that. China is also being very, very resolute on Taiwan. So from our point of view, with the Cold War over and democracy having really started to take root around the world, it was up to Ukraine to decide what they wanted to do. No one should make deals over their heads. That's what had happened all through history in what Timothy Snyder calls the bloodlands, where large powers would make deals over the heads of Eastern and Central European countries with disastrous results. And so in Washington, there's been a consistent policy of welcoming Ukraine into NATO if they want to join. And this in spite of Russian red lines that have been reinforced along the way. So that's been kind of the underlying issue all along for decades now. In a way, this is a problem that's become overt. But in addition, Putin said some kind of strange things in the summer before the invasion about sort of Slavic culture, and he gave a sort of a skewed history of Ukraine, and so there probably is some kind of an emotional side, maybe even sort of identity, Russian identity side. Kiev is the foundation of Eastern Slavic culture, whether Belarus, Russia, or Ukraine. In any event, by early 2022, it'll be exactly 3 years of the conflict when our new president comes in, by the way. Russia did a Hail Mary. They said, okay, let's have a big conference on security. We want neutrality for Ukraine. We want a larger agreement, kind of something that should have been done, they said, in the 90s, should be done now. And of course, Tony Blinken said, this is gaslighting. We're not going to do this. So, for better or worse, Russia did a very stupid thing from their own point of view. They're paying a high price for it right now. They invaded. I think that Putin thought initially that he could scare the Ukrainians, that just sending troops right to the edge of Kiev and maybe doing a special operation trying to kidnap the government, which failed, would be enough to scare the Ukrainians and cause them to step back and eventually agree to neutrality. That didn't happen. The Ukrainians had great resolve. They fought back. As it turned out, a lot of the Russian speakers realized that they felt Ukrainian, and Putin did not get the welcome he'd expected. So he has gone to Plan B. Plan B is to take what he calls New Russia, which is roughly the eastern 20% of Ukraine, the Russian-speaking section of Ukraine, which unfortunately controls the coast. It has most of the really good farmland and industry. So it's essential to Ukraine. What the Russians want to do is to take all that, finalize it. They've already incorporated it into Russia according to their Duma, right? It's officially Russian territory now. And then get peace terms in which they keep that territory, and the West agrees that that Ukraine should remain neutral. That's pretty much what Russia is looking for, and then for some kind of a larger agreement. I personally, looking at how weak Russia is and how much they're struggling, I don't see them at this point moving further. I don't think they want to take Western Ukraine, which would be a real hornet's nest for them, given the strong Ukrainian nationalism in Western Ukraine, not to mention moving on to Poland. No. Someday down the line, who knows, right? And so NATO is very important for all these countries. But at the present time, I think that what Putin wants is to nail down what I just described. And there's nobody in the West right now willing to give this to him, but there is a war fatigue that we're seeing in the electorate, on both sides of the Atlantic. It's manifesting itself in the rise of populist parties. The Republican candidate is playing that card very hard, as someone who wouldn't have allowed these wars and would stop them immediately. And we'll see how that plays in our election. So, but in the meantime, Russia is moving toward Eurasia. They say their future now is in Eurasia with China, with Iran, Turkey. They say that Russia's history of aspiring to the West is over. That's what they say. And of course, it's easy to say. And I think at some point, Russia will gravitate back toward the West, but it's a long ways off.
Do you think this 20% of Eastern Ukraine agree with annexation to Russia? Do you have reliable information about that? Because Russia usually says that yes, this part of Ukraine would love to be part of Russia. But it's one side of the story. I was wondering if you have any reliable information
Yeah,
about
it's
that.
very complicated to see. I mean, I think most experts agree that Crimea is very largely pro-Russian. I mean, there's a Tatar population there too, but it's a minority, and a lot of the people there are Russian speaking. When it comes to eastern Ukraine, the Donbass and Zaporozhye and such, it's more complicated. That's also Russian speaking, and it's true that in the 2014 Maidan revolution, when the new government came in Kiev, they enacted some pretty severe sort of anti-Russian speaking legislation, right? Banning the Russian language, that sort of thing, which I think was a mistake on their part. I mean, they should have moved toward, openness toward a federated Ukraine of some kind, but they decided to go that way, which I think stiffened the resistance in eastern Ukraine. Now, a lot of Russian speakers over there, once the invasion happened, as I say, they discovered that they wanted to support Ukraine. And so it's not like I think Crimea, yes, largely Russian backing, but that eastern part, no, not necessarily. That was a Russian miscalculation. But I think as these nearly 3 years have gone by, I think a lot of Russian speakers who oppose what's happened have gravitated to the West, to Western Ukraine and then further to the West. And that maybe you've had a kind of a sorting going on in which the people who are left now in those lands are maybe the part of that population that was more positively disposed to Russia. And in addition to which, Russia has forcibly removed a number of children and members of that population to Russia, for which they are being looked at in the International Court of Justice for a crime against humanity for doing that. So, yeah, it may be that they can somewhat stabilize that eastern part, but very unlikely that they'll stabilize the rest of Ukraine and allow them to, and that they would allow this, because one problem for Zelensky is he may have thought of compromising early in the war, the idea of neutrality, but there are powerful groups within Ukraine, some of the militias, armed groups, which will oppose that to the death. I mean, they will simply not allow that kind of compromise by a Ukrainian leader. So at some point, that will also have to sort itself out. As I say, for the next president, Ukraine is, it's a very uncertain future, and it's full of risks as Ukraine lamentably is being worn down now, as I described.
So you received another question also about Ukraine. The downside for Ukraine is clear, but what is the downside for NATO countries if Ukraine loses the territory you discussed? Does that downside change if Ukraine then becomes part of NATO?
So a lot of people in NATO and also in Washington are looking at the spin-off effects of compromising on Ukraine. The one I hear most looks toward Taiwan and says, oh my gosh, if we don't stand up for the Ukrainians in this situation, the Taiwanese will not trust us to stand up for them. And therefore, partly, I mean, China is, the one thing that both parties in Washington agree on is standing up to China. And so anything that seems to be weakening our hand in Asia is serious, and a lot of people see a negative outcome in Ukraine as doing that. So Poland, the Baltic states, the countries that are close into Russia are very worried that if Putin gets what he wants, he won't stop. That this will reinforce him, it'll whet his appetite, and he'll look for ways to keep going. And that could be, as I say, I think that at least right now, given the weakness that Russia has shown, and their economy long term, I mean, our sanctions have not brought them to their knees at this point, but the long-term prognosis for what these sanctions are doing is more serious for Russia, and I think they know that. And so I think that the Russians would like to get some kind of an agreement, some kind of a ceasefire here, but obviously on their terms, which is not happening right now, right? And so, you know, I must say that when I listened to J.D. Vance's proposal that he floated, I mean, that could be the basis of, I suppose, of an agreement. But as I say, that NATO and especially the Western Ukraine would just never countenance that, and would probably react very severely to that kind of an outcome. So NATO is stronger right now than it's ever been because of the addition of Finland and Sweden. But within NATO, it's more complicated because of the rise of these populist parties, many of which, in fact, most of which are anti-NATO and are against any further aid for Ukraine. And so NATO has got to find its footing in the aftermath of all this. And of course, the West has proven itself unable to give Ukraine what it needs. You know, we haven't geared up for a war like this for decades. You know, we've fought mostly from the air, from a distance. The war in Ukraine is like World War I. It's a trench war, brutal battle where you need ammunition, basics, and we've not been producing that for a long time. And it's very hard to gear up our defense industry to do that quickly. So I feel for Ukraine. I worry that I just hope we don't let them down, having encouraged them all along and in a very key juncture early in this war. I think we really owe it to them to stand with them, but obviously in a way that doesn't start World War III if possible.
Shouldn't. Let's talk a little about the war in Israel and Palestine. So some of your colleagues were still active, the foreign service officers. They have resigned one after another due to their disagreement with the US policies in supporting Israel against the Palestinian population. And that kept going and is happening. So my question to you is, is the government not listening enough or close enough to the diplomats and to their advice? Or the diplomats they do not have all that power, or something else? Because if they are dissatisfied, even if the last word belongs to the politicians, is still the diplomats should have a way to find a diplomatic solution as opposed to a war solution.
Yeah, so there's a whole litany of issues here. I mean, the State Department is often not listened to, at least the working level, not too much. I think, you know, the beginning of the downsizing of our diplomacy actually began with Bill Clinton, who downsized the foreign affairs establishment by about 40%. The idea was we'd won the Cold War, and he had something called reinventing government. And then when 9/11 happened, our diplomats were sent to Afghanistan, Iraq in provincial reconstruction teams, which were not really diplomatic roles, but the Foreign Service was not beefed up after that. And then during the Trump years, a lot of senior people left. And so, yeah, state is not in its strongest moment right now. That's for sure. And someday we're going to have to really beef up the diplomacy. Arguably, in recent years, we've been relying more on sanctions, economic sanctions, and military policy in a lot of these issues. The one big diplomatic breakthrough I think that we made recently was the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, which was undone. The problem is that for a treaty to pass, our Senate, you need a 2/3 majority. And there's no way that you can get that kind of majority given our polarization. So whatever agreements we do reach are usually by executive agreement rather than by treaty, which means they can be undone with another executive order by the next president. So anyway, so state is not in the strongest position. The frustration has been that the Biden administration embraced Netanyahu at the beginning of this crisis. And the word was, we want to be a friend, we want to embrace the Israelis in order to influence them later, right? In other words, we'll establish total credibility in our total support for them, but then try to deflect them in a, as Joe Biden said to the Israelis, don't make the same mistake we made after 9/11, right? Basically overreacting. The problem is that although there's been dialogue between, say, Tony Blinken or Amos Hochstein from the State Department with the Israelis, a lot of our arguments don't seem to be getting through. And so the frustration, I think, in some rank and file at state is that we're not having the leverage we wanted. We're still giving Israel everything it wants, which there's a consensus to do, and that this is leading to this is being noticed around the world that the United States right now is not getting its way here. And our soft power is being affected by this, by what's happening there, right? The issue that really brought this to a head and with the State Department happened recently, where a number of studies at state, I think maybe NSC, I can't remember, anyway, exhaustive studies showed that the Israelis were actually preventing aid from getting to the Palestinians in some cases, which we have been urging them not to do. We've been urging them to make sure that that aid flows. The word is that Secretary of State Blinken got those memos, but then went to Congress and declared that we had no indication that aid was being withheld. This is what led certain State Department people to really react, and one of them to resign. And my understanding is that Congress is looking at this actually. I don't know whether this will go anywhere, but the idea that maybe they were lied to on this issue. And you may have seen that recently the Biden administration, for the first time, gave a vague threat to cut off military aid to Israel within 30 days if they don't allow aid to come into northern Gaza, right? If they implement harsher policies in northern Gaza. Now, this kicks the issue past the election. So we'll see what happens. But I guess, Israel is they're a sovereign country, and they're saying that they will make these decisions. They listen to us. We talk, obviously, but in many ways, Israel has got its own policies and all this, and they aren't always the same, unfortunately, as politics of the Biden administration. Now, when it comes to Kamala Harris, is expressing a bit more empathy for the Palestinians, but has not talked about a different policy. And Donald Trump has said the fighting should stop. He says this in a kind of a transactional way, but then he'll say Israel should finish the job, whatever in the world that means. I mean, that's open to all kinds of interpretation, and it hasn't been clarified as to what his policy really would be here. So, yeah, it's a tricky situation. A number of people have resigned from the U.S. government because of it.
Okay, so The Economist reports that Russia is interfering in our election. With the presidential election toss-up, what are the chances that Russia has a decisive impact on our election?
It's so hard to estimate. I look at statements by some of the Silicon Valley types. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg, back in 2016, and else, who say that given the vast sea of the Internet of Things, that even though Russia is doing a certain amount, that it's, in their view, a small slice, very small slice of what's actually happening out there.
Mhm.
I mean, I don't know. I know that there's been a lot of research about the various organizations in Moscow that are churning out this stuff, and it is true that there can be a huge ricochet effect across the internet. I'm not enough of an expert to say, but I get the impression that it, given how vast the internet is, social media, how polarized we are already. I mean, people don't really need another push in many cases, right? I mean, all the polls show that people's minds are pretty much made up. So I have questions about how decisive the impact is. I mean, that there's an impact, yes, but how decisive, I just really can't say clearly for sure.
BRICS.
Oh boy,
So,
yes.
what trade relationships or treaties are most affected by the increase in BRICS memberships? Is there a trade issue for the US beyond the possible end to using the US dollar as the main trade currency?
Yeah. So the BRICS, I mean, it's developing in a kind of a measured way. The original 5 members are not trying to force agreement on things because it is, as I say, it's a geoeconomic gathering. It's not an alliance. Nobody is trying to enforce any discipline here. They're trying to engage a very broad entente or coalition of countries, even outside of Eurasia, on the Eurasian continent. And so for the Chinese, it dovetails very nicely with the Belt and Road Initiative. So they're able to find some parallelisms between the BRI and what's happening in the BRICS. You know, at the beginning of the Belt and Road Initiative, the Chinese invited us to participate. In fact, they invited us to become a member of the BRI Infrastructure Bank, which we declined. Britain joined it. David Cameron joined the bank, and so I guess there's a question, you know, whether we should be just opposing everything that's happening there. The danger for us is that because of our own polarization at home and the protectionist mood that we have here, that we're kind of absenting ourselves from a lot of the structures that are taking shape. For example, Barack Obama came up with the idea of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which we instigated and got people to sign on to as an Asian trade arrangement without China, right? And in the 2016 campaign, first Donald Trump and then Hillary Clinton came out against the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And so we withdrew, and there's absolutely no sense that we would get back into something like that, just given the protectionist sentiment here. And so we're also in opposition to what's happening in the BRICS and the BRI and sort of thing, which is fine. But we're not succeeding in keeping countries from joining it, including some of our allies. And in a way, we risk sort of absent, unless we come up with some pretty concrete counter proposals that can attract countries. If we don't want to join these and we want to oppose them, we really should come up with some counter proposals. And by the way, it's ironic that on the eve of October 7th, we had announced a new India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor, which was going to go by sea from India through the Middle East, through Saudi Arabia, up through where all the fighting is going on now, as a way of kind of countering all the institution building that China and Russia are doing. And of course, that's now a dead letter, given what's happening. And it was also one of the reasons for pressing the Saudi-Israeli reconciliation before October 7th. So where we're likely to see things affecting us would be if the BRICS really do succeed in developing even an embryonic currency mechanism that would not be on the open markets, it would be used for as a clearinghouse arrangement among countries. Already right now, there's a lot of kind of barter and use of mutual currencies to avoid the dollar. That's already happening. Yeah, Janet Yellen has announced that she told Congress that because of our sanctions, a lot of countries are moving away from the dollar because they don't want to be sanctioned. You know, we have secondary sanctions against everybody, including our allies in many cases. So she said, but that's okay. This is temporary. She said, yes, that the number of people holding the dollar has gone from like 69% to 55%. That's fine, not to worry. But I personally look at our deficit, which if it keeps going up the way it is eventually going to undermine confidence in the dollar, combined with these new efforts, even if they're just sort of fledgling efforts, to work away and around the dollar. So I think that one of the main issues for the BRICS is that. Another one is, and I'll just mention this briefly, as an example of how China is doing very well in tech, they have moved in some areas away ahead of us in the application of quantum technology. So already several years ago, the Chinese launched a quantum satellite and pulled off communication between Asia and Europe using quantum technology, which cannot be hacked. So this is actually a pretty major breakthrough. So the BRICS have announced that they're going to discuss quantum communication for the BRICS at this Kazan summit. Like I say, I don't think the technology is there yet necessarily, but it'll be interesting to see what they come up with in that regard. So no, the BRICS definitely bear watching. And as I say, I feel we have to be careful we don't isolate ourselves in the global economy going forward.
Well, we are close to the end, and I wanted to leave you with one last question before we close
Great.
here. But so elections are almost there. With all the information bombarding the population, including fake news,
Yeah.
wars, domestic problems, and of course the US policies regarding international scenario and domestic matters, what we, the normal people, the population who are not in charge, what should we look for when we go and vote?
Well, I mean, I would not for a minute tell people how to vote. I mean, that's everyone's decision as a member of a democracy. So, boy, there's a lot of factors. I mean, I think that the balance between domestic issues and rule of law issues here at home is important compared to, as I say, these three populist issues that are driving a lot of politics in the West right now, not just here, but in Europe as well. The immigration issue, the economic issue, and then the war issue, right? And I guess I would say that if a candidate is not giving specific policies and solutions and is speaking in very vague generalities, I would be a little bit wary. There aren't any magical solutions to any of these things. I also would look at the likely economic results of what each candidate is proposing. Their policies differ somewhat, and so I would take a close look at that because we want our economy to stay on an even keel, and you know, for our own political health and stability, you know, we need a strong economy, and one that, in my view, is becoming more equal, ideally. So, I mean, it's up to each individual to trade off all these all these different factors. It's going to be close. I would predict that we won't know the result probably for maybe even a number of weeks after the election takes place. Although who knows, maybe it'll be more clear cut than anyone imagines right now. It's going to be a fascinating moment, and believe me, the whole world is watching and is in many cases holding off on big decisions until they see what happens here. And I just hope someday soon that we will kind of stabilize and be less of a factor for uncertainty in the world. You know, during the Cold War, because of a sense of a threat, they always said that politics stops at the water's edge, and there was actually more consensus on foreign policy than met the eye. And I guess I feel if we are clear about what the threats are, and I do believe that they are increasingly things like climate change and really global threats, that we ought to be able to come to that kind of comedy again. So as I say, I'm hopeful. I mean, our country's always gotten out of this sort of thing before. As Churchill said, America always does the right thing, having exhausted all the alternatives. So I hope we've exhausted them by now, and we'll have a good road ahead.
Well, it's been wonderful. And on behalf of CGS Minnesota, I want to thank you all for attending. If you want to watch again, the recording of this discussion can be found on our website and our YouTube channel. Please check our website for updates. If you have questions, please send an email to us, cgsmn.contact@gmail.com. Tom, on behalf of CGS Minnesota, Citizens for Global Solutions Minnesota, we extend our heartfelt thank you for this enlightening and deeply impactful presentation on the global challenges in this critical year of election. The insights you shared are invaluable, especially as the world faces pivotal decisions that will be shaping our future. We are truly grateful for your time and expertise. Please do keep in touch.
I will, Katya. Thank you so very much for your warm welcome, and thanks to all those who attended from Citizens for Global Solutions. You're doing important work, so I wish you all Godspeed. And until next time.
Thank you. Next time.
Thanks, Katya.